we've had, populism and nationalist language is nothing new in world history, but we have seen this dramatic rise caused by COVID-19. I'm wondering if you can speak in your capacity to the way we're talking about these issues in Australia and the way language has changed.
Yeah, so thanks, Ben. Really building on what Ahmed has said, before the COVID pandemic, the refugee movement was making real progress around acknowledging lived experiences expertise, around moving towards being refugee-led. And while there was still quite a long way to go, we were moving in the right direction. Similarly, there was kind of a broad acceptance of the way we frame refugee issues and the importance of using progressive frames and the importance of using strengths-based language as opposed to deficit-based language. And again, it wasn't perfect, but we were kind of moving in the right direction. And in light of this crisis, refugees and people seeking asylum have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 and actively excluded from the supports that have become available, as Ahmed alluded to. I mean, you look at who has access to Medicare, who has access to financial support, who is even able to self-isolate. Like, these are all things that kind of are very, very clear examples of how refugees and people seeking asylum have been disproportionately impacted. And while there needs to be kind of a policy and program response to these issues, in advocating for these things, I've seen a re-emergence of some of this language and some of these, negative frames and some of this deficit-based language. Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, yeah, the rise of deficit-based language that really paints refugees and people seeking asylum as a burden to the system, and also kind of drives this like Anglo-Christian model of who needs help and who gives help, which kind of creates this binary around that exacerbates like the white savior complex, and hinders the progress we're making towards things being refugee-led. And second of all, I've also seen this rise of programs that don't actually meet people's needs, which kind of is also hindering this refugee-led idea, because I think there's been this desperation to move everything online. And while I understand why that is a key concern for a lot of people, the programs that are now being moved to being delivered online were designed in a time that's radically different to the time that we're living in now. And so we've kind of tried to copy and paste these programs onto online platforms, when in reality, because the world is so different and needs are so different now than they were back then, we're not thinking, okay, well, what is needed by a community at this time? And so they're the kind of key issues I've been seeing re-emerging in light of this crisis.
Sorry, everybody. Thank you very much, Jeanine. I'm still working out the technology and how to mute and unmute myself. Craig, can I turn to you? Your campaign, Game Over, is particularly focused on people in detention who remain in detention. Now, we're all being told to socially distance, but that doesn't seem possible when one's in immigration detention. Can you talk to us about your campaign and the issues you see that COVID-19 has presented to people who remain in held detention?
Oh, well, thanks, Ben, and Jeanine and Ahmed, and everyone who's joining in. Thanks for your time. I think the first thing I would say, Ben, is, it's only for the last couple of years that I've been actively involved in this space, and I'm always very careful to acknowledge and thank all of these incredible people who've been involved over a very, very long period of time. And it's been an incredibly difficult journey. And at the moment, COVID has exacerbated the issues that we see from this huge cohort of people, particularly who've been offshore. And those who I know, last October I went across to Port Moresby to meet as many people who'd been on Manus Island as I could, to learn myself and try and come back and reflect those learnings to Australia through the various channels that I have access to try and have a different discussion with Australia around this, because the more that I learnt about it, the more I was just staggered that Australia has ended in the situation where we are now. So starting from that perspective, I think, this pandemic has made many of us, I hope, and certainly I've been seeing an increasing amount of positive writings and videos and other things where people are reflecting on broader society, what social justice means, what the concept is of each country. And when we talk about asylum seekers more narrowly, about, the global mobility, the issue that that's providing for people, and this concept of human rights that I'm so interested in, whereby human rights in various countries are actually obstructing, access to information, transparency, accountability at government level, and all of these themes in different countries are impacting not just Australia, but other countries as well. So this sense of a global humanity is, I think, starting to be amplified during this pandemic. And in my view, that can only be a very positive thing. Within that, where my kind of lens is at the moment is, how does Australia, what is Australia, and how do we fit into that global family? And what are we, what do we represent? And this refugee and asylum seekers area, which I've been involved in and am so passionate about, one of the reasons is because it is in complete discord with what my understanding was and view is of what Australia should be. So it's, if someone came in from outside and just came and had a look at what's been going on with refugees and asylum seekers in Australia and offshore detention, you would be staggered to believe that, all of us are not picketing Parliament House, that all of us can actually, or vast majority of Australia can go to work, disregard what's going on and just get on with business. And our role is to try to bring the stories of those people who are being deeply, deeply harmed, or my role as I see it, to broader Australia, and to give my lens and to give my reflections on that as well, but to let them speak. So what Game Over was about was trying to say to Australia that people have been harmed here over a very significant amount of time, and that decisions made back in 2013 in particular have put people in a state of physical and psychological devastation that most of us never thought that we would see. Ahmad speaks from a position of experience and talked about individual cases. And what I've found, and the reason why I thank everyone who's listening, is because what I've found since I've been involved in it is it's traumatic. Every day the people offshore are in touch. I know they are with you, Ben, as a journalist, and with many of us. And what's happening to these people, I can tell Australia, is horrendous. The stories of people every day going without, needing medical attention, acute, psychological trauma every day, highly medicated, trying to get through the 24 hours, having lasted almost 7 long years and still being stuck in detention, whether offshore in Nauru, whether in PNG in awful circumstances that I saw myself directly, or whether indeed in the immigration transit centres, or in Mantra and Kangaroo Point and others in these APODs. People spending 23 hours a day in rooms. And what troubles me the most is that this whole narrative that's been built around this group of people, or this, what people look as this sector of society, allows Australia to just move on without actually dealing with these human beings. So that, I think, is kind of where I come to the discussion, is that Australia, we have somehow got ourselves in a position, and we can talk about media and other things later, but we've got ourselves into a position where we are severely harming human beings, many of them, and something needs to be done about it.
Craig, we've had a question from Margot Clark, and people on the chat will have seen this. She's asked, when and if detainees are released into the community, how will safe accommodation be found for them? A really sort of practical, nuts and bolts sort of question.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so the answers to that can be provided by all of the advocates and the lawyers and the experts on the call. So, like what's happening in much of society at the moment, I think a lot of us are rightly starting to say, well, when it comes to many of these discussions, we need to rely on the scientists, we need to rely on the medical and health professionals. So, I'm really careful to make sure that I don't go into areas where, where I'm not an expert. You know, I'd rather hear from them. So I can tell you that there's a huge amount of, was it Margot? Yeah, Margot. There's a huge amount of organisations who have, you know, policy framework around that. But even in recent times, you know, we've talked about, private citizens like myself have said that, you know, we'd be happy to take people out of detention because, to your first point, Ben, you know, the medical and health professionals are very clearly shouting and saying that, you know, we all know social distancing or physical distancing is absolutely critical, and that can't be provided in these detention centres and in the APODs. So, you know, it's one of the greatest, most clear expressions of this sense of them and us, is that we all want to be safe. We all want to abide by the health guidelines. And, you know, our government, like every government around the world, is saying, this is what you're being asked to do. Please abide by that, except if you're A, B or C. And one of those cohorts is refugees and asylum seekers, particularly in APODs and in detention. And Australia shouldn't be in the place where that's even acceptable or possible.
Thank you for that, Craig. And look, thank you everyone for the questions. I mean, I've got a run sheet here that we're supposed to be working through, but I'm finding the questions on the side there, these are utterly fascinating. And I think I might kind of just sort of deviate terribly if I don't get in too much trouble. And we might just make this, look, a really Socratic sort of discussion back and forth. And I really welcome all of these comments. There's a terrific question for Jeanine. I hope you don't mind me reading this out from Jessica. It was addressed to everyone. She's asked, Jessica Scannell has asked, can you give examples of what programs are not relevant or meeting people's needs? I think that organisations recognise that online programs are never going to fully meet people's needs in this situation. People need connection and individualised support, but how do you deliver that in this situation? And what would be a better alternative than trying to deliver programs online? That's for you, Jeanine.
Yeah, well, that question come up a few times, so I think I'll be answering a couple of people's questions in my response. But from Rose Refuge's perspective, we had a couple of programs we were running with partner organisations that we started planning before COVID, and they were kind of all around storytelling and capacity building around storytelling. And I remember kind of one of them is a regional exhibit that's kind of touring regional Victoria that now obviously all the galleries have closed. And so we've had to take that, you know, rethink how we're doing that. And so, you know, the immediate response was, let's do online viewing rooms of the gallery. And we were like, oh, but like, is that really, we were really questioning, is that really what community needs right now? And so, yeah, and so we're trying to rethink the way that we are providing something to community during this time. Similarly, there was a project we were running with another partner organisation with Iranian refugee women around telling their stories of hope and what gave them hope along their refugee journeys. And we kind of were meeting all as a group around what the new program is going to look like without even asking the women whether this program was still something they wanted, given that this is a brand new kind of world that we're living in. And so I think what the solution is, and what I'm calling for, is some more community consultation and speaking to people who are actually impacted by these policies and being most directly impacted, and asking them what they need. And while online solutions aren't perfect, tailoring those to them, as opposed to just taking pre-existing programs and taking them online.
Thank you, Jeanine. The questions are now really coming in. One of the ones that was a little bit earlier, and I may have lost it in my little screen. Yeah, from Adugan, and again to everybody. And it's addressed to Craig, but I think Ahmad or Jeanine or Craig or anybody who wants to contribute here, we'd be interested to hear from. And as a Guardian journalist, I hear this a lot around one of the ongoing issues in this space is preaching to the converted. You're talking to people who are already receptive or open or interested in the welfare of people seeking asylum. How do you, I suppose, in these days of filter bubbles and all sorts of things, how do you break out of that and begin to speak to a wider cross-section of the Australian community? How do you reach more people? Any takers? Ahmed, I think you're trying to talk, but you're on mute.
No, I'm not in the mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. If Jeanine and Greg don't mind, I'll just take this question. All right. So what we found out in the like a traditional advocacy or conventional advocacy. It's all happened by the people with no lived experience. And that's why we, Jeanine and other organizations, we started to bring up the voices of the people with lived experience and contribute in the advocacy. So the people lead the campaign about the issues affecting them. So the traditionally never happened in Australia. So and that's why people they from the broader community, they have no idea about how the people what's happening to them and how and their suffering and struggles, unfortunately. So what we are doing at the moment, and we're planning to kind of get the communities and also people from refugee communities and the members from the refugee communities to be powerful. And that's why we're going to skill them to connect and communicate with broader communities. So through that, they're going to tell their stories through food, through arts, social art, and so on. And that's what we see. Hopefully, we see the community attitude is going to change through that.
Yeah,
so the people they know the stories and they know the struggles of the people, and then also they know the beauty of the cultures, the people they bringing here, and they interact with each other. So we have a more inclusive culture in this country.
I also, sorry, I might just jump in as well and just say that in terms of bringing more people along into the movement, I think this crisis has really created an opportunity for us to do that, because I think a lot of people in kind of mainstream Australia are now experiencing things that refugees have experienced on a daily basis for a long time. And so there's an opportunity to leverage that and to kind of tap into this shared humanity and abolish these false barriers of us and them through kind of this newfound empathy that everyone is experiencing.
Yes, and I might just add finally there, that's a really great point, Jeanine, and but it is very true. It is a significant challenge, and I think in part because of this kind of polarised nature of much of the public debate in Australia at the moment. That is, you're either right or you're either left, and if you're speaking on one of the issues, then you must be in that camp, and therefore you can also be, one of the issues is if you're just speaking through only a small number of media channels, then you're very quickly identified with a group of people who are talking to each other. And so we do have a number of these echo chambers in the country. So it is a big challenge. And I've been very vocal to continue to reject that, is that, the new discussion should be just purely issue-based, and that we don't need to pigeonhole people into any political ideology just because they care about human beings or happen to think that we shouldn't harm people, as just this being just one example of many of the discussions. Climate change is another fantastic example. But to go more specifically to the question, I think you do need in what you would call the sector of refugees and asylum seekers, this group of wonderful people who are trying to bring change to an area in which, in my view, Australia desperately needs to move forward for both the well-being of these human beings who are being directly affected and also to the betterment of the country. I would say that you need to always be reaching out to try to bring Ahmad's stories through different voices and through different people in the community. And that means connecting them in. And that's why going to Port Moresby, which is not open to everyone, but going to Mantra, meeting people, getting into the communities and becoming, seeing the stories, hearing what's going on is so critically important.
Thank you, everybody, for your contributions there. Can I go to Tim Dymond? You had a question? You're not on my screen, Tim, but you might come up if you start.
Yeah, I'm up here somewhere, so I have to talk. Thanks. Yeah, look, my question was just really about sort of first principles, really, without necessarily sort of being a specialist in a particular policy area. I'm wondering whether under pandemic conditions, we need to revisit some of the first principles about how we regard refugee rights. Now, of course, refugee rights, I think, are human rights. So in that sense, really, if nothing's changed for in human rights, then nothing's changed on refugee rights. But in terms of being under pandemic conditions, the right to claim asylum when you're faced with a well-founded fear of persecution, do we have a genuine limit or a genuine difficulty there that hasn't been there in the past? Or is this an opportunity to, I think as Jeanine was saying, to recast perhaps the debate about sort of, common experiences of what refugees have more in common with sort of people who aren't refugees, rather than sort of starting with that refugee, non-refugee distinction?
Let me say, I'm just interested, Tim, are you talking a sort of legal framework? Are we going to rewrite the Refugees Convention this afternoon? Or are we talking more a kind of, I suppose, approach to these issues? And given so much at the moment is in tumult, has been sort of turned upside down, we're seeing sort of quite extraordinary policies from a government, the sorts of policies we wouldn't normally associate with a conservative side government. Are you saying, given everything's being rethought and everything's on the table at the moment, we can sort of radically reshape the way we approach the entire issue of forced migration of people seeking asylum and refugees? Is that what you're asking?
Well, maybe that's a better question than what I was asking, but what I was actually thinking about was, yeah, look, people don't adhere to frankly, governments don't adhere to the Refugee Convention, and arguably haven't for years. So in that sense, you could argue it's been a bit of a dead duck for the last couple of decades. So in that sense, are we in a position now to actually sort of rethink the whole way we deal with that? We deal with sort of people claiming asylum just as an immediate practical issue. That's what the convention was supposed to handle. Yes, so really, is there an opportunity now to reboot the whole discussion around something different? Or do we want to be perhaps a bit more cautious on that, still not to throw the Refugee Convention out with the bathwater, so to speak?
Anybody from the panel interested, or anybody from the sort of collection of faces I see in front of me on my screen who'd like to chip in on that? I think it's a really interesting point. In this sort of time of crisis, is there a sort of opportunity being presented here to say we can do things differently? We can imagine the world differently. We can go down the sort of Philippe Legrain path of borderless worlds and those sorts of things. I mean, there is perhaps the potential here to have discussions and consider ideas that, in more usual times, would perhaps struggle to gain traction.
I think a lot of us are hoping that, Ben, that, that's what I alluded to at the start of the conversation, is I think there's a lot of good voices, a lot of new voices. So one of the things a lot of us are looking for now, certainly I am, is who's speaking out, who are the new leaders who are emerging? What are the new discussions that are being had? Who's making sense of all of this for us, in what is such a kind of threatening time, but a time that sadly it needed a pandemic for us all to be able to take a pause in our life, and then reflect on many issues individually within our own kind of context. The challenge now is to get Australia, of course, to focus on some broader issues as well. What worries me, and one of those refugees, asylum seekers, what worries me is that this is going to become a kind of political and culture war again as we emerge out of the pandemic, because this is the opportunity for everyone to kind of trying to claim more ground, or at least not have ground taken from them in an ideological sense. And I hope that we are able to have a national debate and discussion around these issues in a more sensible way than we've clearly been able to do for a very long time. But one thing about, the asylum seekers and refugees, in particular in detention right now, is, to me, is a really prime example of this concentration of media and, you know, for want of a better word, it's an overused word, but it's a good one, the demonisation of particular cohort of people. Because Australians are, you know, by and large, wonderful people. And you saw what happened during the bushfires. So when Australians are faced with compassionate situations where that's where their heart is opened or it's touched and they're asked to contribute, they will. But you can see here the effects of 10 years of constant demonisation of human beings in this country, who simply fled for purely legitimate reasons, that now Australia's actually been able to say, well, you know, we don't really care. You know, we want job seeker and we want, you know, job keeper and we want all these things. But this group, you know, we're prepared to go forward, you know, and it's only largely the sector making the noise. And that's the real challenge now. How do we bring Australia, the broader Australia, to the table to see the harm that's being done? That's a huge challenge. It's one that I'm committed to. I have some ideas on it, but again, Jeanine is right. What the sector could and perhaps is looking at now is how can you reflect their issues? For instance, we've all been confined, you know, for the last month or whatever it is, and people, you know, and people are talking about, rightly, you know, domestic violence and mental health things are really serious. But, you know, a lot of people are saying, look, you know, this is really hard, right? So it is an opportunity to say, yeah, well, you know what, you know, that's 7 years that these people have been really behind bars, right? And start to tell those stories again. It's going to take some real expertise, much more than I have, but to bring these issues, you know, into the consciousness, and more than that, actually into the heart of Australians.
In terms of refugee, I might just jump in terms of refugee resettlement, I think what we've seen in light of the crisis is that there's been this rise of nationalism and this push for more closed borders, which of course I understand why that has been a priority area for the government, but what that has meant is that refugees are not being resettled even though their visas are being successfully processed. And I read an article yesterday that said the Labor government is calling for decreased immigration after this crisis. And so what we're really seeing is that this is being used as an opportunity to increase protectionism, which is really driven by this narrative of who is Australian and who isn't Australian, and who is deserving and who is undeserving, and who is useful and who isn't useful. And I think there is an opportunity here to kind of reshift that narrative. And as I mentioned, we were on a positive trajectory that's now kind of gone in terms of self-determination, that's gone completely in the opposite direction. There's an opportunity for us to rethink kind of who is us and who gets to make these decisions and who gets to shape this narrative. But the conversation just is not there yet. Because it's too saturated by media and politicians pushing this like very, very nationalistic and closed border and protectionist policy frame.
And it's interesting, Craig, there you're talking about the sort of policy framework, and Jeanine very much around the sort of political rhetoric and discourse that exists. But it strikes me that those two things are very, very closely interlinked, that the rhetoric and the narrative that exists creates the environment where those sorts of policies are reasonable, are achievable, I suppose. So, you know, in this country, we don't have an immigration department anymore. We have a border force. We don't have asylum seekers. We have illegals. We have this very deliberate contortion and manipulation of language to change people's understanding of what's happening, and that feeds into that dehumanisation. Sorry, Jeanine, I just got on a bit of a delay there. Apologies.
No, I was just going to say they're interdependent, but also they have impacts that last well beyond when this crisis is over. And so while it's harmful now, it's going to be harmful for a very, very long time unless we get, you know, this narrative and this discourse shifted and under control.
Can I go now to Shabnam Safa, who's the chair of the National Refugee-Led Advisory and Advocacy Group? Apologies, I wasn't sure if you're on the call or not, but can I go to you now?
Hi, Ben, that's all right. Thank you, and thank you to everyone else. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands from which we're gathering here today, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and especially at times like this, acknowledge their contributing and continuing connection to the land and country. I suppose I'll just, as has been mentioned by Ben, part of the National Refugee-led Advisory and Advocacy Group, just do a little brief overview of what it is that we do. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to Ahmed, Jeanine and Craig, and would like to thank you for your very insightful words. Why conversations like these is very important, especially in times like this. So the National Refugee-led Advisory and Advocacy Group, NRAAG, was recently established. It's a refugee-led entity with the purpose of creating spaces and platforms to do exactly what we've been talking about today, to bring voices of former refugees, people seeking asylum, people with refugee-like backgrounds, for them all to be included in those key decisions and policies, public and media discourse that happens about them every day. The aim is to ensure that, you know, people whose lives are impacted the most by decisions made and actions taken are also key and essential players in that decision-making process. So NRAAG envisions that we would do this by informing key policies, service delivery, campaigns, research, key initiatives, you name it, anything that affects the lives of the people that we represent, that we are, because it is not a few people's job. It's a whole of society approach, and it's extremely important to bring everyone on this journey. If we're talking about changing the language and changing the narrative, and as has already been highlighted quite strongly, like, you know, that those who have first-hand experience, those who have that expertise as the impacted communities, are best placed to create solutions, most effective and efficient solutions to their own challenges. And that's a guiding principle deeply entrenched in all of NRAAG's work and everything that we have been doing since being established from the beginning of this year. So we're fairly new, but we're very determined to work with a strengths-based approach and using that expertise of our own lived experiences and join forces with key players in the space, because we agree and accept that we can't do this by ourselves. And as much as refugee voices and lived experience voices are very important to be leading and shaping this conversation, it needs to be a partnership between the refugees with lived experience and those key players, like, you know, massive organisations, advocacy organisations, settlement services providers, government, research bodies, and a whole lot of other players in this space. So to do exactly that, before we moved into the whole COVID-19 environment, we held our first inaugural Australian Refugee Dialogue. An event like that hadn't happened before. In February, we brought refugees and people seeking asylum from across Australia together in Brisbane to explore what the best way of achieving our own aim, NRAAG's aim, would be, and how we engage others in that time, and how we check how our priorities align with the priorities of those in this space. But in line of COVID-19, in this very challenging situation, I suppose we were pushed to a bit of a deep end, and we've been focusing a lot of our efforts ever since then in making sure that no one is left behind. And it has been extremely hard and difficult to, you know, go from campaign to campaign and still receive no acknowledgement from the policymakers in the space. We have written to the Prime Minister, we have written to several dozen of MPs advocating on issues that we've been talking about today. We have joined calls with unions to include temporary workers, including people seeking asylum and refugees, in the different financial supplements. And we've also been working with peak bodies in this space. You know, it's a very complex, actually refugee sector is a very complex space, and just, you know, maneuvering the system is very important. So we've been working with peak bodies to identify the gaps that are already existing in the space, and how the government and these organisations are coming together, and how we can join forces to make sure that our efforts have the most impact. out there. And this has been in the form of policy advocacy as well as contributing to media discourse to, we've been talking about it, to take back that narrative, to ensure that the voices of those impacted are at the forefront of anything that gets put out there about them. We've been doing this in form of public statements, media releases, anything that we've been able to amplify lived experiences of people impacted the most. In fact, we held our first COVID-19 consultation with the communities, with people from refugee background communities and those seeking asylum. I would like to say that it was actually the first of its kind in Australia, where it was a space hosted, obviously over Zoom, but a space hosted, a safe space, in that only for people from those backgrounds, to make sure that we're having some very honest and open conversations about how they are being impacted and what the best way forward would be, and really emphasizing on the fact that we're going into this with a strong belief that people impacted can create this solutions. And in line with that, we have actually published our report today, this morning. It went live on our website. I will put the website link in the chat box for everyone to give us a visit. But in line with that guiding principle, we haven't just outlined all the issues that are impacting these communities. We have, for each issue, we have outlined recommendations on how the sector and the government and peak bodies and all the other key players can help achieve those solutions. A total of 26 recommendations to help tackle only COVID-19 related issues, and around a broad range of topics, from asylum issues. We've been talking a lot about detention, to digital literacy, to mental health and emerging issues, making sure that we remember it is extremely important that we remember the minorities within this community as well. As marginalized as the refugee community might be, we also have other groups of further marginalized members within our community, such as the LGBTIQ community members, such as refugees with disability, the elderly members of the refugee community, and to make sure that, to help everyone help these community members. So the report that we've published today is to provide direct and immediate feedback from the community to everyone in this space, to our partners, to our allies and supporters, to help them better target their efforts, because we understand we can't do this all by ourselves. And in addressing these issues, make sure that no one is left behind.
Thank you, Shabnam. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. There is a link there that everyone can see. I'm just aware that we're starting to run short of time, but thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And people can see the NRAAG website in the chat comments there. There are a couple of linked questions I'd like to go to, but I also want to come back to Ahmad about reimagining things differently. I might do these couple of questions first. There was one from Kerry that I'm looking for, and he was she or he, I'm not sure, forgive me if I've got that wrong, basically saying, what can those of us who aren't working in this area do to help? And the linked question from N. Freuden is there a platform in this space where we can share our area of expertise so we can use it effectively to provide support? I suppose these are really nuts and bolts questions for people in the sector to have that discussion, but how do people find each other, and what can people do?
Thanks, Ben. So there is no share platform where people they can come and get help. So as I mentioned in the first, thank goodness we got those charities, food bank and so on. They put on their social media, and they provided help to a lot of people. So yeah, so there's no kind of share space for people to kind of share, gather information and also get help. But the communities, because they come in from struggles and they I call them, we are survivors. So they have between themselves, for example, social media during all this lockdown, so physical distancing, they created that platform between themselves in their language to share information and gather help from each other. For example, the person I mentioned to you, he's a person from my own communities, and he called me because he understands my language, and that's what is absent at the moment. There is a government when it started kind of sharing this information and of COVID-19, how to react to this crisis. They forget those people completely. They forget they can't speak the language. They forget they kind of because a few organizations they used to interact with them physically. They can't go anymore because they closed because of the COVID-19. And also that's what the big issue is. These people, they've been left in dark, and that's when they went back to their country. To their communities, and they start sharing information and asking for help from people within their communities.
Ahmad, thank you very much for that. We have a couple of minutes left. Graham, Thom, are you out there somewhere? I'm led to believe you are. You're not on my screen.
Sorry, I'm unmuted now.
Yes, there you are.
Hi, Ben.
Hello, mate.
Good to see you.
You too. Graham, we have a couple of minutes. I just thought, as Amnesty International's refugee coordinator, I think that's your title. Apologies if I got that wrong. Can you, I suppose, am I able to ask you for a summation of your work, of your view of the situation? You've been working in this area for a long time, or just some reflections on what you've heard today?
Oh, no, thanks, Ben. Look, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I think it really has covered a lot of the issues that we're really dealing with at the moment. I mean, we have a situation where there are potentially 800 Rohingya refugees on boats in the Andaman Sea who were pushed back from Malaysia because of the rise of xenophobia against refugees in Malaysia, and Bangladesh is refusing to take them back, and these people are about to run out of food. We had a couple of boats rescued a few weeks ago, and 400 people rescued, and 30 people had starved to death on those boats. So, when we talk about how countries are closing their borders and stopping people seeking asylum, unfortunately, we are in a pretty desperate situation at the moment. We talked about resettlement and how resettlement numbers are down around the world. So the ability to get people off Nauru and PNG at the moment is really difficult. There's still 436 people on PNG and Nauru who, as Craig has pointed out, have been there for 7 years, and it's getting increasingly desperate for those guys. And we had a number of them ready to go to the US, and yet the US is now talking about stopping all migration for a short period. So but a lot of effort is going on behind the scenes to at least help those people get to safety. But at the same time, we have, as Craig pointed out, the ones who are here, who are still in detention in the APODs, and the government ignoring medical advice to get those people out into safety, when we know there are organisations who deal with refugee resettlement who've put up their hands to say, look, we can look after them. Nobody's being resettled here. There's accommodation. There's experts who can deal with this. Why don't you let them look after these people? And yet the government is ignoring all expert advice when it comes to people in detention. And similarly, I think the discussion, from the groups who've spoken about, people who are seeking asylum, and the first-hand accounts of asylum seekers at the moment who have lost their jobs. There are organisations working really hard to get people into jobs, and asylum seekers were doing everything they can to get into jobs. They want to work, they want to support their families, but a lot of them are in the service sector, and they were the first to have their jobs cut. And as Shabnam's highlighted, they don't get any support. They're not amongst the people with the JobKeeper and the job seeker support. They were already losing their support. What little was being offered, before the crisis. So, there are some amazing groups out there that are bending over backwards to help these individuals, but this is really short term. And so unless we get some states on board, unless we get the federal government on board, we are looking at a crisis for asylum seekers in the community. And, again, sadly, New South Wales is one of the state governments that hasn't stepped up to offer support for temporary migrants. And I think, if you are online here and you're living in New South Wales, perhaps you want to get in touch with the state government here too, to say, what, you can do a bit more, because other state governments are stepping up. But this is a crisis that's impacting on refugees around the world at the moment, and the ability for people to seek asylum. And I think, the good news, as Craig's pointed out, is that there are a lot of people, at least in this country, who are very passionate about this issue. And we do have groups who are representing the voices of asylum seekers themselves, and they are speaking out themselves, which is really crucial, I think, if we are going to get the message out to the broader community. And we can't shift government until we do that. And I think that's, where Amnesty's focusing, and I think that's where a lot of the people on this this meeting are focusing. But hats off to all those groups that are doing that frontline support, because it's so crucial at the moment.
Thank you very much for that, Graham. We have run out of time. Can I say thank you to everybody who's come today, contributed to the discussion. I'm really grateful to all of you for your time and your thoughts and your passion for this issue. History is written by those who show up, and you've all showed up this afternoon, so I'm really, really grateful. I'm reminded of that, Pete, that Margaret Mead quote: "Never doubt that a small group of committed, thoughtful citizens can change the world." Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I will hand over to Kirsty for summing up, but again, thank you very much all for your time and your efforts today.
Thank you so much, Ben, and seeing lots of celebration and congratulations and gratitude in the chat. So thank you everyone who's posting. I want to do a big shout out. Thank you so much, Jeanine and Ahmad, for sharing your expertise today, and for those who called in and shared theirs as well. And obviously Ben and Craig, thank you so much for being part of this session today. We've all learned a lot, and Australia at Home folks will send around some links. So if you have links that have been shared in the chat, we'll make sure you have access to the organisations who've been mentioned today. And this will be recorded, so if you want to share it around, please do, and get behind the great work of Road to Refuge and Refugee Voices. Thank you so much. There's these sessions happening every day. Tomorrow I've got Peter from Essential talking with Catherine Murphy about the Essential poll, and we've got some great sessions coming up over the next week. So tune in at 1 p.m. every day. Otherwise, have a lovely afternoon. Thanks, everyone.